The two-star general stood at rigid attention before me, his medals gleaming under the harsh interrogation lamp. And in that moment I understood the magnificent cruelty of fate with a clarity that bordered on the divine. Here I was, a 20-year-old private first class who had fled Vienna as a child, with nothing but a single suitcase and 10 marks sewn into my mother's coat lining, and before me stood one of the most powerful men in the collapsing Reich. His jaw was set in the defiance of aristocratic pride, but I could see the fear flickering behind his pale blue eyes, the same fear I had once known as a boy, watching the flames consume our synagogue on that terrible November night. The irony was so profound it nearly stole my breath. A Jewish refugee from the ashes of Austria now held the fate of German royalty in his trembling hands. But I am getting ahead of myself, and stories must be told in their proper order if they are to be understood. To grasp the weight of that moment in the interrogation room, you must first know the journey that brought me to it. A journey that began in the cobblestone streets of Vienna, wound through the terror of Kristallnacht, crossed an ocean of desperate hope, and finally delivered me back to the continent that had tried to destroy my people. This is not simply a story of war, though war forms its terrible backdrop. It is a story of transformation, of a boy who became a soldier, and of a soldier who discovered that the truest victory lies not in vengeance, but in bearing witness to history's darkest chapters. I was born in Vienna in the spring of 1924, in a modest apartment above my father's textile shop on Tauberstrasse in the Jewish quarter. My earliest memories are of the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral echoing across the rooftops at dawn, and the smell of my mother's apple strudel cooling on the windowsill while she hummed old Hebrew melodies. We were not wealthy by any measure, but we were comfortable and content, and my father spoke often of the golden future that awaited me in the city of Mozart and Freud and Mahler. Vienna was a place of culture and refinement, he said, a city where a Jewish boy could grow up to become anything he dreamed of becoming. The first signs of danger came when I was barely 6 years old, though I did not fully understand their significance at the time. My Uncle Samuel had traveled to Munich on business, and one evening he encountered a group of brown-shirted men outside a beer hall in the old city center. They demanded to see his papers, and when they discovered he was Jewish, they beat him with clubs and boots and left him bleeding in the gutter like a stray dog. He died 3 days later in a hospital ward, his face so swollen and disfigured that my aunt could not recognize him through her tears. The adults spoke of it in hushed and fearful tones, but children hear more than their parents imagine, and I learned then that there were men in the world who hated us simply for the blood that flowed in our veins. The hatred spread like a plague across the border into Austria with terrifying speed. By 1934, Austrian fascists were openly marching through the streets of Vienna, and swastikas began appearing on walls throughout our neighborhood like a spreading infection. My father's shop became a target for organized boycotts, with picketers carrying signs that proclaimed Jews were vermin and urged good Austrians not to contaminate themselves by doing business with us. I remember watching from the upstairs window as my father stood helplessly on the sidewalk below, his face a mask of dignity and barely contained despair, as customers he had known for decades crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk past the demonstrators. Within 6 months, he had sold the shop at a devastating loss to a Gentile competitor who offered a fraction of its true value, and our slow descent into poverty began. My mother was the one who saved us from complete ruin, while my father retreated into depression and denial, sitting for hours in his armchair staring at nothing. She began making quiet arrangements for our escape, contacting distant relatives who had emigrated to America years before, securing the necessary documents through channels I still do not fully understand. She booked passage on a steamship bound for New York, paying for first-class tickets with money she had secretly saved over the years, hiding it from even my father in a tin box beneath the floorboards. On the morning of our departure, she woke me before dawn and told me to dress quickly and quietly and to leave behind everything except what I could carry in one small suitcase. We slipped out of our apartment like thieves fleeing the scene of a crime, leaving behind furniture, photographs, books, and everything we had ever known or loved. The journey to the port in Rotterdam took 3 anxious days, during which my mother maintained a facade of calm that must have cost her dearly in silent suffering. We traveled by train through Germany itself, a terrifying passage through the very heart of the beast that was trying to devour us. At every station along the route, uniformed men boarded to check papers with cold and suspicious eyes, and each time my mother smiled and handed over our documents with hands that never trembled, despite the terror that must have gripped her heart. I did not learn until years later that she had bribed a corrupt official to obtain those papers, spending nearly everything we had left in the world. When we finally boarded the Holland-America liner Volendam, she collapsed into her cabin berth and wept for hours, while I sat beside her, not understanding her tears, but knowing somehow that they were necessary and even sacred in their way. We entered the United States on the 28th of October, 1938, passing beneath the outstretched arm of the Statue of Liberty as the autumn sun painted the New York skyline in magnificent shades of gold and amber. My mother held my hand so tightly I thought my fingers might break from the pressure, and tears streamed down her weathered face as she gazed upon that copper colossus that has welcomed so many millions of desperate refugees. "Remember this moment," she whispered to me in a voice thick with emotion. "Remember that there is a place in this world where people can be free to live without fear." 12 days later, on the 9th of November, the Nazis unleashed Kristallnacht across Germany and Austria in a coordinated orgy of destruction and terror. Every synagogue in Vienna was burned to the ground that night, including the one where I had celebrated my bar mitzvah just a year before. Its ancient Torah scrolls consumed by flames set by mobs of ordinary citizens who had transformed overnight into monsters. My grandfather, who had refused to leave the city where he had lived his entire life despite my mother's desperate pleading, was arrested and sent to a concentration camp somewhere in the east. We never heard from him again, and it was not until after the war that we learned he had perished in the gas chambers of Auschwitz along with millions of other innocent souls. Our first years in America were difficult beyond anything I could have imagined in my sheltered Viennese childhood. We settled in a cramped tenement apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, surrounded by thousands of other refugees who had fled the same nightmare spreading across Europe. My father, whose English was poor and whose spirit had been utterly broken by the loss of everything he had built over a lifetime, could find only menial work as a janitor in a garment factory. My mother took in laundry and sewing, her once elegant hands growing rough and red from the harsh soap and endless labor. I was enrolled in public school, where the other children mocked my thick accent and my strange European clothes and called me names I pretended not to understand. But I was determined to become American, to prove myself worthy of the sanctuary this country had offered us when no other nation would open its doors. I studied English with a fierce determination that surprised even my teachers, and within 2 years I could speak without a trace of foreign accent. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, I was 17 years old and burning with an almost desperate desire to fight against the forces of tyranny that had destroyed my world. The news came on a Sunday afternoon while I was playing stickball in the street with some neighborhood boys who had become my friends. Someone came running out of a building shouting that the Japanese had bombed our naval base in Hawaii, and nobody knew exactly where Pearl Harbor was. But within hours, the streets were filled with young men eager to enlist in whatever branch would have them. I understood immediately what this meant. America was going to war against Japan, and Germany would soon be our enemy too, since the Nazis had made a pact with the Japanese Empire. For the first time since fleeing Vienna, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. The monster that had devoured my homeland and murdered my grandfather would finally be confronted by a force powerful enough to destroy it utterly. When I turned 18 in August of 1943, I was drafted within weeks. My induction into the United States Army brought an unexpected complication that nearly derailed my military career before it began. I reported to the reception center at Fort Dix, New Jersey, expecting to be sent to basic training within a few days like everyone else in my intake group. But while my fellow recruits received their orders and shipped out to various training camps across the country, I remained behind, assigned to endless rounds of kitchen duty that left my hands raw and my spirit increasingly desperate. When I finally demanded an explanation from my sergeant, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and bureaucratic helplessness that I have never forgotten. You're classified as an enemy alien, he explained with obvious discomfort. You were born in Austria. Your last passport was German, even though it was revoked when you fled. And you never became a naturalized citizen of the United States. The FBI had to investigate me before I could be trusted with a weapon, and until that investigation was complete, I was essentially a prisoner in my own army. The sergeant must have seen the anguish on my face, because his expression softened slightly, and he offered me a lifeline. "I hear you've had some military training," he said. "How would you like to avoid KP duty?" He made me an acting corporal responsible for marching new recruits to their orientation films while I waited for clearance that might never come. The FBI investigation took 3 agonizing months, during which I showed those same 2 orientation films more times than I could count. One of them explained why we were fighting, with stirring footage of Nazi atrocities that made my blood boil with righteous anger and longing for revenge. The other warned about venereal disease in terms so explicit that even the tough city boys from Brooklyn squirmed uncomfortably in their seats. I became an expert on both subjects, though I would have traded that expertise for the chance to fire a rifle at the enemy. Finally, in late January of 1944, word came that I had been cleared. Within days, I was shipped to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training, and 2 weeks after arriving, I was summoned to the federal courthouse in Columbus. A judge administered the oath of citizenship while I stood with my right hand raised, repeating words that transformed me from a stateless refugee into an American. Walking out of that courthouse with my certificate clutched in my hands, I felt tears of joy streaming down my face. I was no longer an enemy alien, no longer a man without a country or a home. I was a citizen of the United States, with all the rights and responsibilities that sacred status entailed. A training accident nearly ended my military career before I ever saw combat when an instructor accidentally threw a white phosphorus grenade instead of a smoke grenade during a gas mask drill. The incendiary material burned through my uniform with terrifying speed, scorching my wrists, hands, and ears before I could tear off my equipment and throw myself into a water trough. I spent a month in the hospital recovering from the burns that left permanent scars I carry to this day, and when I returned to duty, my unit had progressed far beyond my physical capabilities. I struggled to keep up with the grueling marches that my comrades handled with ease, and the division commanders eventually transferred me to a replacement depot bound for Europe. I arrived in England in late October of 1944, then crossed the Channel to France, where I spent weeks in a depot near Paris, listening to the distant thunder of artillery and wondering when my chance to fight would finally arrive. That chance arrived in an unexpected form when a staff sergeant approached me in the mess hall one evening and asked if I spoke German. I told him I did, fluently, in fact, since it had been my first language. His eyes lit up with obvious interest. "We need German speakers for interrogation work," he said. "There's a 2-week intelligence course starting tomorrow in Liège." I did not hesitate for even a moment before accepting. The course crammed months of training into 14 exhausting days, and many of my fellow students were refugees like myself, Jews who had fled Germany and Austria and were now returning to confront their persecutors with the full weight of American military power behind them. Upon completing the course, I was assigned to Interrogation of Prisoner of War Team 67, attached to the intelligence section of the 12th Army Group Headquarters under General Bradley himself. Our team consisted of 2 officers, 2 interrogators like myself, a sergeant, and a driver. The officers and interpreters were issued special uniforms with no visible rank insignia, designed to confuse prisoners about exactly who was questioning them. I removed my PFC stripe and donned the anonymous uniform with grim satisfaction. When I walked into an interrogation room, the German officers would have no idea that the man questioning them was the lowest-ranking soldier in the American army or that he was Jewish. The real work began when we crossed the Rhine at the Remagen Bridge and pushed into the German heartland. German resistance was crumbling rapidly, and as word spread that Americans treated prisoners humanely, surrendering soldiers began streaming toward our lines in ever-increasing numbers. In early April, we reached Frankfurt, where the prisoner compound overflowed with captured officers of every rank. I worked 18-hour days, interviewing dozens in rapid succession, probing for any hint of war crimes or hidden intelligence. The interrogation that changed my life began on a gray April morning in a windowless room that smelled of cigarette smoke and human fear. They brought in a 2-star general with ramrod posture and the unmistakable bearing of old European aristocracy. He clicked his heels together with Prussian precision and stood at attention before my desk as if awaiting a royal audience rather than an enemy interrogation. I began with standard questions, asking his name, rank, and unit assignment. When he answered in clipped, formal German, I felt the blood drain from my face. He was August Wilhelm von Steinhardt, a name I recognized from my childhood history studies. He was a direct descendant of the last German Kaiser, a prince of royal blood, standing at attention before a Jewish refugee who had fled his empire with nothing but a suitcase. The irony was almost unbearable in its perfection. I could see in his aristocratic eyes that he had no concept that the anonymous interrogator before him represented everything his beloved Nazi ideology had sought to destroy with such methodical thoroughness. I did not complete that interrogation. As soon as I understood the significance of my prisoner, I reported to my commanding officer, and within hours the prince was transferred to higher headquarters for questioning by officers far above my pay grade. I never learned what became of him. Our most effective interrogation technique was threatening to hand uncooperative prisoners to the Russians. By April, every German knew what awaited them in Soviet captivity, and when we suggested such a transfer might be arranged, even the most stubborn officers found their tongues loosening considerably. In late April, we received orders to proceed to Magdeburg on the Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces were making their historic first contact. My captain received orders to cross and establish liaison with the Soviet command. He needed an interpreter. I don't speak Russian, sir, I protested desperately. I only know one word, tovarish. He shrugged with tired resignation. Close enough. Grabbed a map and get in the boat. We crossed in a commandeered rowboat, and when we reached the far bank, Russian soldiers embraced us like long-lost brothers, kissing our cheeks and pressing vodka into our hands while laughing with pure joy. A young sergeant communicated through pantomime and single words. "Moscow," he said proudly, pointing to himself. "New York," I replied, pointing to my own chest with equal pride. "You come Moscow," he suggested hopefully, gesturing eastward. "You come New York." I countered with a grin. We both laughed, understanding each other perfectly despite the absolute barrier of language. Weeks later, I understood that joyful reception. The Russians had been fighting Germans for 4 years, suffering unimaginable losses. When they saw American uniforms crossing the river, they knew their terrible ordeal was finally ending. They were celebrating their own miraculous survival as much as they were welcoming their unlikely allies. I returned to America in early 1946, discharged with the rank of corporal. My mother waited at the pier in New York Harbor, older and grayer, but with fierce pride burning in her eyes. She embraced me and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving in Hebrew, the ancient language of our people that had survived so many centuries of persecution. We had both survived the storm, she in her cramped tenement apartment praying for my safety every night, I in the smoking ruins of the empire that had tried so systematically to destroy everything we were and everything we represented. The decades that followed brought the ordinary joys and sorrows of peacetime life. I married a woman named Sarah who had also fled Europe as a child, and together we raised 3 children in a small house in Queens. I built a career in the garment industry that my father had once dreamed of for himself, and I watched my grandchildren grow up speaking English without any trace of foreign accent. For many years, I did not speak about the war, preferring to leave those memories buried in the deepest vaults of my mind where they could not haunt my waking hours. But as years passed and other witnesses began dying one by one, their stories vanishing into eternal silence, I understood that remaining quiet was a luxury I could no longer afford. The Holocaust was fading from living memory, transforming into abstract history that young people learned from textbooks rather than from the trembling voices of those who had witnessed it. For 3 decades now, I have devoted myself to Holocaust education, working with museums and schools to ensure that the terrible lessons of those years are never forgotten. I have spoken to thousands of students, watching understanding dawn in their young eyes as they grasp the magnitude of what occurred. Some weep openly, others sit in stunned silence. All of them leave changed in some way, carrying with them a knowledge that I pray will inoculate them against bigotry and hate. This is my sacred mission now, the final chapter of a journey that began on the cobblestone streets of Vienna nearly a century ago. I am 99 years old, and I know my remaining time grows short. But before I go, I want to leave this testimony for those who will inherit the world we fought to save. Ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose courage over fear and justice over vengeance. Hatred, when left unchecked, can destroy entire civilizations. But hatred can also be defeated by those who refuse to surrender to despair and who stand firm in defense of human dignity. The battle my generation fought must be fought again by each generation that follows. Remember this tale.